Hello everyone, SG Dad here. So today is the second day of Chinese New Year, and I just managed to sneak out while in one of my relatives' house. Right, so I thought I'd just share some thoughts that came to my mind, during this Chinese New Year where we have a lot of conversation with relatives of different age group. Right. Generally, the conversations will revolve around like property investment, one of the favorite topics, and cryptocurrencies, stock markets, and stuff like that. Yeah, the pretty much the same kind of conversation you typically have every year lah. Right, so people will start comparing, of course, not in a negative way, lah. Yeah, but more of talking about the different kind of investment instruments. And I also try to bring up the topic of retirement and, just sharing one of my colleagues' story who, choose not to retire even when he's already at 65 with not much of a commitment, totally financial free kind. Yeah, so surprisingly, many of them can really understand why, especially those in their 50s. Right, they see working as the default, and if there's no strong reason to stop, and they are still able to work, so why stop? Yeah, that's their mentality, which is very different from mine, which I shared in my previous video, which I mentioned stop working 9 to 5 at an earlier age make more sense to me. All right, then we also touch on a topic, right, on whether Singapore is a good place to stay or whether they have considered migrating or relocating. Most of them, in fact, I think all of them, right, say they would rather spend their strong Singapore dollars on traveling once or twice or even 3 times a year, right, than to uproot and relocate completely, right? So it seems that almost all of them prefer to stay in Singapore, to retire in Singapore, even if given a choice to retire overseas. I can conclude in a few key reasons. Right, maybe let me find another spot to talk about the reasons. Okay, the first reason is Singapore's status. Right, most of them take pride in being a Singaporean, believe it or not. All right, although we may complain here and there, we talk about the negative aspects of Singapore, rising prices, influx of foreigners, or whatever. You can still feel a sense of pride when they talk about Singapore. Right, especially when they travel and use the strong currency, right? I think they feel happy that overseas goods are cheaper, while at the same time, maybe they feel proud in being able to survive in an expensive city like Singapore. So it's just like, to give an analogy, it's like asking them to relocate from a CCR region to a OCR region, from Orchard to maybe Sembawang, right? I'm no offense to those staying in Sembawang, but you get the idea. Right, so even if Sembawang has good amenities, super convenient, and is a much more livable place compared to Orchard, they will still, most people will still choose to stay in town because of the status, right? So it just feels good being in an expensive city, living in an expensive area. So I think that most people will be unwilling to give that up. Right, and the second reason, which this I personally agree with more than the first, is the ease of growing wealth in Singapore. Right, if you compare Singapore's median income with that of other countries, even developed ones like the US, the wages are pretty decent. Right, if you are deliberate about growing your wealth aggressively, you can achieve that in Singapore. So for example, people in my age group who bought their first house 10 years ago, BTO at that time, you can get it at a relatively attractive price in a non-mature area. So even for now, I think it's still quite fairly priced. Okay, of course, not talking about the negative aspect of long waiting time and stuff like that. So paying off your BTO, then start growing your wealth is very doable. And in fact, if you are paying using your CPF, you will not be touching your cash savings at all, right, for the monthly mortgage. So if you practice good financial habits, we are able to accumulate a substantial amount of savings. But I'm talking about people maybe in my age group 40s or 50s. For those who are fresh grad, I'm not so sure, right? Maybe they do have a higher median income now, as shown by the stats. But housing are also crazily expensive now, especially if they are not getting a BTO. When it comes to relocating to another country for work, the wages may or may not increase. But one major factor which I 100% agree with is our tax system. I think our taxes are very low compared to other developed countries. So if you know how to save on taxes using the different tax rebate, you end up not paying that high of a tax. And another thing about tax is our investment income is tax-free, and we don't pay tax on capital gains or dividends compared to other countries. So because of these reasons, and the fact that there are always cheaper options for many things like food or transport, living cost can be well managed. So if you choose expensive options, of course your expenses will be high, but if you go for cheaper alternatives, your net worth can increase quite significantly, especially during your prime years, like from your 30s to your 40s. So I think all these factors make Singapore a great way to stay and grow wealth, which a lot of people or locals are unwilling to give that up. And now for the third reason, which I also kind of agree with, is safety. Singapore is a safe city, and I believe many foreigners who live, work or travel here would agree. Right, so we can safely travel at night even for youngsters or the elderly, so we don't see a lot of homeless people around. When it comes to safety, I think Singapore is indeed a super safe country. So you will feel secure to have a family here. You will not experience that kind of stress that you are unable to go out at night. And I think safety is also something that Singaporeans may take for granted because we grew up here. So we assume that this is the default and this is normal. But in fact, if you speak to foreigners or you read discussions on their forums, like for me, I browse Xiaohongshu, the Chinese app, they really mention about safety being one of the main reasons they want to come to Singapore. So believe it or not, many of them are very impressed with that. And the fourth reason is again mentioned by more of the foreigners instead of the locals, is that we have a rather competent government. So political stability in Singapore is generally very strong. We don't see riots, strikes or people protesting in the streets. And also the government doesn't really oppress citizens in an obvious way, at least, maybe not as directly as in some other countries. Of course, there are policies and areas where I feel the government could do better or sometimes be less defensive, but I won't go into that for now. Maybe in the future I do, especially during the general election where all our moods are in that, right? Okay, then we will talk about political stuff, right? So anyway, compared to many other countries, I think generally our government tries to solve problems when it arises. So the way they implement policies may sometimes be not as perfect. It's just like any organization. There may be good policies with very good intentions, but when come to the middle management, they are too focused on showing good results or meeting KPIs or show some nice numbers. It can lead to the objectives not being met or deviate from the initial intention. Okay, then for the last parts, I will mention about some miscellaneous reasons, and I feel that these are pretty subjective, right? You may or may not agree with them. For example, some people say Singapore has a lot of good food, many food choices. Yeah, that's one reason they can't survive, overseas without Singapore food. Then there are people who mention cleanliness. This is the one I don't agree with, right? But yeah, many foreigners perceive it as a super clean city. Then there's the education system. So some people believe that our education system is one of the best, like our universities are highly ranked. And so for those who migrate to Singapore, they feel that putting their children through our education system will give them a head start or even a stepping stone to the West. Also, Singapore is a major hub with many opportunities, with many MNCs, and also being an English-speaking country is a good gateway to Western countries. These are some of the miscellaneous reasons that through the forums I read, right, through the conversations I had with my relatives, think some of them they may try to be not be so direct, and when we have such conversation, usually we tend not to speak too much of a good things about Singapore, right? I think it's just normal. It's always easier to complain lah. Sometimes you just need to ask a little bit more. Hey, since you complain about this, have you thought of migrating? Then you will hear all the reasons lah, the goods of Singapore. Having said that, I still choose to relocate with my family. So I think I'll share the reasons why in my next video, despite Singapore being such a popular country for foreigners, why we chose the opposite. Alright, see you in the next video. I got to rush back to my relative house now. Bye bye.